The morning Celestine Ashford learned she would be sold arrived not with fanfare, but with silence. Her father did not look at her when he delivered the news. He stood with his back to the window of his study, hands clasped behind him, shoulders rigid as though bracing against some invisible wind. The light from outside painted him in shades of gray, and Celestine thought, distantly, that he looked like a monument to something already dead. Her mother was not present. Her mother had not been present for anything that mattered in a very long time. She was upstairs in her rooms, lost in the fog of laudanum and grief, mourning a life that had slipped through her fingers years ago, before Celestine had even been born. Before we go deep into this story, do not forget to subscribe to my channel. My kid said I can't get to 1,000 subscribers before 2026, and I actually want to prove them wrong, and let me also know the country you are watching from. The Duke of Ashencourt has made an offer, her father said, and his voice was flat, stripped of anything resembling warmth. You will accept it. Celestine stood in the doorway, her hands folded at her waist, her spine straight, because that was what had been drilled into her since she could remember. A lady does not slouch. A lady does not speak unless spoken to. A lady does not question the men who hold her fate in their careless hands. But inside, something cracked, a hairline fracture that she knew would spread, would consume her if she let it. She didn't let it. Not yet. I see, she said, and her voice was steady. She was proud of that, at least, that she could stand there and speak as though her world had not just tilted off its axis. Her father turned then, finally, and looked at her. His eyes were tired, ringed with shadow, and she thought she saw something in them, regret, perhaps, or shame, but it was gone before she could be certain. He is a man of great standing, Celestine, wealth, influence. This marriage will secure your future. It will secure this family's future. Celestine wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. She wanted to ask him what future he imagined for her, shackled to a man she had never met, a man whose name was spoken in drawing rooms with a mixture of reverence and unease. The Duke of Ashencourt. Eldritch Ashencourt. A man who had been old when her father was young. A man who had buried 2 wives already, though no one spoke of them except in whispers, as though their ghosts might rise if named too loudly. There were rumors, of course. There were always rumors. Some said he had driven them to their graves with his coldness, his cruelty. Others said he was cursed, that no woman who married him would ever know happiness. And still others said he was simply unlucky, that fate had dealt him a harsh hand, and he had learned to bear it with the stoicism of a man who expected nothing better. But she said nothing. She only nodded once and turned to leave. Celestine. She paused, her hand on the doorframe. This is for the best, her father said, and she wondered if he was trying to convince her or himself. She did not answer. She walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hall, and she did not cry. Not then. Not where anyone could see. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparations, a whirlwind of seamstresses and milliners, and well-meaning women who clucked over her like hens, speaking in hushed, pitying tones when they thought she could not hear. Poor girl. So young. Such a shame. But what can be done? A father's debts must be paid after all. And the Duke is very generous. Very generous indeed. As if his generosity somehow made up for the fact that she was being handed over like a piece of property, like a painting or a horse or a parcel of land. As if the weight of his gold could somehow balance the scales against the loss of her freedom, her dreams, her very self. Celestine endured it all with a calm that surprised even herself. She stood for fittings, her arms outstretched, while yards of silk and lace were draped over her like a shroud. She smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, and kept her thoughts locked away where no one could reach them. At night, alone in her room, she stared at the ceiling and imagined a different life. A life where she was not a pawn in her father's desperate gamble. A life where she could choose, where she could breathe, where she could fall in love with someone who looked at her and saw not a solution to a problem, but a person, a woman, someone worth knowing. But those thoughts were dangerous, and she did not let herself linger on them for long. Hope, she had learned, was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had seen the Duke only once, and that from a distance. He had come to the house to finalize the arrangements, and she had watched from the window of the drawing room as he descended from his carriage. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair more silver than dark, his face stern and unyielding as carved stone. He moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had never been denied anything in his life, and Celestine felt a cold knot of dread settle in her stomach. This was the man she would marry. This was the man who would own her. This was the man whose name she would bear, whose house she would inhabit, whose bed she would share. The thought made her feel sick, hollow, as though something vital had been scooped out of her and discarded. She turned away from the window before he could see her, her hands trembling. The wedding was held on a gray October morning, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The chapel was filled with people Celestine did not know, their faces a blur of polite smiles and curious stares. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her gown a cascade of ivory satin that felt like a cage. The fabric was beautiful, exquisite even, but it weighed on her like chains, and she kept her eyes fixed on the altar, on the figure waiting there. Eldritch Ashencourt stood with his hands clasped before him, his expression unreadable, and when she reached him, when her father placed her hand in his, she felt the weight of his grip, firm, unyielding, inescapable. The vows were spoken. The ring was slipped onto her finger. The priest pronounced them man and wife. And through it all, Celestine felt as though she were watching from a great distance, as though this were happening to someone else. The Duke did not smile. He did not speak to her beyond what was required. When the ceremony ended, he offered her his arm, and she took it because there was no other choice. His arm was solid beneath her hand, and she wondered absurdly if this was what it felt like to be a prisoner being led to the gallows. Dramatic, perhaps, but in that moment, it was the only comparison that made sense. The breakfast that followed was a tedious affair, filled with toasts and laughter that grated against her nerves. Celestine sat beside her husband, what a strange, terrible word, and picked at the food on her plate. She could feel his presence beside her, solid and immovable, and she wondered what he was thinking. If he was thinking of her at all. She doubted it. Men like him did not marry for love. They married for convenience, for alliances, for heirs. She was a means to an end, nothing more. A womb to carry his children, a face to grace his table, a name to add legitimacy to his already formidable standing. She was not a person to him. She was a function. When it was finally over, when the last guest had departed and the carriages had rolled away, the Duke rose from his seat and extended his hand to her. "Come," he said, his voice low and even. "It is time to leave." Celestine took his hand and let him lead her to the carriage that would carry them to Ashencourt Manor, the estate that would now be her prison. The journey was long and silent. The Duke sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the window, and Celestine was grateful for the reprieve. She did not want to speak to him. She did not want to know him. She wanted only to survive this, whatever this would be. The countryside rolled past in shades of green and gold, the trees shedding their leaves in slow, mournful spirals, and she thought of her old life, the life she had lost. She thought of her mother, who had not even come to the wedding, too lost in her laudanum haze to care. She thought of her father, who had sold her to save himself from ruin, who had gambled away their fortune and their name, and had decided that the easiest way to restore both was to trade his daughter for the Duke's gold. And she thought of herself, the girl she had been just weeks ago, and wondered if that girl still existed somewhere, or if she had been erased entirely. The carriage came to a stop as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with crimson and gold, the colors so vivid they looked almost unreal. Celestine looked out the window and saw Ashencourt Manor rising before her, a sprawling edifice of gray stone and dark windows, its towers piercing the sky like accusing fingers. It was beautiful, in a cold, forbidding way, and she felt her chest tighten as the Duke descended from the carriage and turned to offer her his hand. She took it, and he helped her down, his grip steady and impersonal. "Welcome to your new home," he said, and there was no warmth in his voice, no attempt at reassurance. He turned and walked toward the entrance, and Celestine followed, her heart pounding, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The interior of Ashencourt Manor was as cold and imposing as its exterior. The entrance hall was vast, the floors polished marble that reflected the light from the chandeliers overhead, in fractured, glittering patterns. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women who stared down at her with what felt like judgment, their eyes following her as she passed. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals catching the light from the candles and scattering it in fractured rainbows that danced across the walls and floor. Servants appeared as if from nowhere, silent and efficient, taking her cloak and gloves, their eyes averted as though afraid to look at her directly. She wondered if they had been trained to behave this way, or if it was simply the natural response to living in a house like this, under the rule of a man like the Duke. The Duke led her through a series of corridors, each one seemingly longer than the last, the walls lined with more portraits, more dark wood paneling, more shadows that seemed to press in on her from all sides. The house was silent save for the sound of their footsteps, and Celestine felt as though she were being swallowed whole, consumed by this place that would now be her cage. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, and the Duke pushed them open and gestured for her to enter. "These will be your rooms," he said. "You may arrange them as you see fit." Celestine stepped inside and found herself in a suite that was undeniably grand. The walls were papered in pale blue silk, the furniture dark wood and richly upholstered, the bed a four-poster draped in heavy velvet curtains that looked as though they had not been drawn in years. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, and for a moment she felt a flicker of something that might have been comfort. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, creeping realization that this was her life now. This room, this house, this man. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke nodded once, then turned to leave. But he paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something in his eyes, something she could not quite name. "I will leave you to rest," he said. "We will speak tomorrow." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Celestine was alone. She did not rest. She could not. She paced the room, her hands clenched at her sides, her mind racing. This was her life now. This cold, silent house, this distant, unknowable man. She thought of the years stretching out before her, endless and gray, and felt the tears she had been holding back for weeks finally break free. She sank onto the edge of the bed and wept, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wept for the girl she had been, for the dreams she had harbored in secret, for the life she would never have. She wept for the mother who had abandoned her to her grief, for the father who had sold her without a second thought, for the future that had been stolen from her before she had even had the chance to reach for it. She wept until there were no tears left, until she was hollow and aching and exhausted, her eyes swollen, her throat raw. And then, as the fire burned low and the shadows lengthened, she heard a soft knock at the door. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wiped at her face, trying to compose herself, but she knew it was useless. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, and there was no hiding what she had been doing. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse. The door opened, and the Duke stepped inside. He carried something in his hands, a small wooden box, and his expression was as unreadable as ever. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been regret, or sorrow, or something else entirely. "You have been crying," he said, and it was not a question. Celestine looked away, shame burning in her chest. "I'm sorry," she said. "I did not mean to." "Do not apologize," he said, his voice sharp, and she flinched. He crossed the room and set the box on the table beside the bed, then stepped back, his hands clasped behind him. "I am not blind, Celestine. I know what this marriage is to you. I know what I am to you." She looked up at him, startled by the use of her name, by the raw honesty in his voice. "Your Grace, Eldritch," he said, cutting her off. "You may call me Eldritch. We are husband and wife after all, and I see no reason to stand on ceremony when we are alone." She swallowed, unsure of what to say. He stood there, watching her, and for the first time, she saw him not as the cold, distant figure she had imagined, but as a man who looked tired, and perhaps a little sad. A man who carried his own burdens, his own regrets, his own losses. "I did not choose this marriage any more than you did," he said quietly, and the admission surprised her. "But I will not apologize for it. I needed a wife. You needed security. That is the way of our world, and there is no changing it." He paused, then gestured to the box. "But I am not a cruel man, Celestine, and I do not wish for you to be unhappy." She stared at him, unable to speak, and he turned toward the door. But before he left, he looked back at her one last time. "Open the box," he said, "and know that whatever you choose, I will not stand in your way." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the box and 1,000 questions she did not know how to ask. Celestine sat there for a long moment, staring at the box. It was simple, unadorned, the wood dark and polished, and she felt a strange sense of foreboding as she reached for it. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, and when she saw what lay inside, her breath caught in her throat. It was a key, a single, ornate key, its handle wrought in intricate silver filigree, the metal cool and smooth beneath her fingers. And beneath it, a letter, folded neatly, her name written on it in a strong, elegant hand. She set the key aside and unfolded the letter, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "Celestine, I do not pretend to know what your dreams were before you came here. I do not pretend to understand the life you imagined for yourself, the hopes you harbored, the future you believed was yours to claim. But I know what it is to be trapped by duty, by expectation, by the weight of a name that demands more than you can give. I know what it is to feel as though you have no choice, no voice, no agency in the course your life will take. This key unlocks the library. It is the only room in this house that has ever brought me peace, and I offer it to you, now, as yours. Within it, you will find books, thousands of them, on every subject you can imagine. History, philosophy, poetry, science, art, mathematics, medicine, music. Some are rare, some are forbidden, some are simply beautiful. They are yours to explore as you wish, to read, to study, to lose yourself in whenever the walls of this house feel as though they are closing in. But more than that, within the library, you will find a desk, and in the desk, you will find papers, ink, pens, everything you might need should you wish to write. If you wish to study, if you wish to create, if you wish to do anything other than sit and wither in this place, you may do so. No one will disturb you. No one will question you. The library is your sanctuary, your refuge, your kingdom within these walls. I cannot give you love, Celestine. I am too old, too set in my ways, too scarred by my own failures to offer you that. I have loved before, and I have lost before, and I am not certain I have the strength to do either again. But I can give you freedom of a sort. I can give you a place where you are not a wife, not a duchess, not a pawn in someone else's game. A place where you are simply yourself, whoever that may be. I do not ask for your gratitude. I do not ask for your affection. I ask only that you do not give up on yourself. Not yet. Not when there is still so much you could be, so much you could do, so much life left to live. Eldritch Celestine read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. She had expected coldness. She had expected indifference. She had expected to be nothing more than a decorative fixture in this man's life, a pretty ornament to parade before his peers, a silent shadow to drift through his halls. But this was something else entirely. This was kindness. This was understanding. This was a gift she had never imagined receiving, a gift that spoke not just of generosity, but of empathy, of a man who had looked at her and seen not just a burden, but a person, a woman who deserved more than the hand she had been dealt. She looked at the key, its silver surface gleaming in the firelight, and felt something shift inside her. The grief was still there, the anger, the loss. But beneath it, something new was beginning to take root. Something that felt almost like hope. It was fragile, tentative, like a seedling pushing its way through frozen ground. But it was there, and it was real, and it was hers. She rose from the bed, clutching the key and the letter, and made her way to the door. The house was silent, the servants long since retired, and she moved through the corridors like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. She did not know where she was going, but she followed some instinct, some pull, until she found herself standing before a tall oak door at the end of a long hallway. The door was carved with intricate designs, vines and flowers, and strange, twisting patterns that seemed to shift and change in the flickering candlelight. She slipped the key into the lock, turned it, and heard the soft click of the mechanism giving way. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. The library was vast, the walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves filled with books. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather and wood smoke. There were chairs scattered about, deep and inviting, upholstered in rich fabrics that looked worn and comfortable, as though they had been sat in many times before. There was a large desk near the window, its surface clear and waiting, and beside it, a globe, an astrolabe, a collection of strange instruments she did not recognize but longed to explore. Moonlight streamed through the glass, silvering everything it touched, and Celestine felt tears prick at her eyes once more. She walked to the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it all in. The books, the warmth, the quiet. The sense that this was a place that had been loved, that had been cherished, and was now being offered to her as a gift. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen, and she felt something in her chest loosen, something that had been tight and cold and hard for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. And for the first time since she had learned of her engagement, since her life had been upended and remade against her will, Celestine Ashford allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she might find a way to survive this. That perhaps, in this cold, silent house, in this marriage that had felt like a death sentence, there might be something worth holding on to after all. She sank into one of the chairs, the letter still clutched in her hand, and stared into the fire. And though the grief was still there, though the anger and the loss still ached like a wound that had not yet healed, she felt something else now. Something fragile and tentative, but undeniably real. She felt hope. The days that followed were strange and quiet, but they were also, in their own way, peaceful. Celestine found herself slipping into a routine that felt almost dreamlike in its gentleness. She woke each morning to the sound of birds outside her window, dressed with the help of a silent, efficient maid named Agnes, who seemed to understand, without being told, that Celestine preferred not to talk in the mornings and took breakfast alone in her rooms. The Duke, Eldritch, she reminded herself, though the name still felt foreign on her tongue, was nowhere to be seen during these early hours, and she was grateful for the solitude. After breakfast, she would make her way to the library. It became her refuge, her sanctuary, the one place in this vast, echoing house where she felt she could breathe. She spent hours there, pulling books from the shelves at random, losing herself in worlds that were not her own. She read poetry that made her heart ache, and philosophy that challenged her mind, and novels that transported her to places she had never dreamed of visiting. She read about ancient civilizations and distant lands, about science and art and music and mathematics. She read about women who had defied convention, who had carved out lives for themselves in a world that had tried to deny them agency, and she felt something stir inside her, something that whispered that perhaps she, too, could find a way to do the same. She wrote, too, filling page after page with her thoughts, her fears, her fragile, tentative hopes. She wrote about her mother, about the woman she had been before the laudanum had stolen her away. She wrote about her father, about the bitterness and resentment she felt toward him, but also about the sadness, the knowledge that he had been drowning in his own failures and had reached for the only lifeline he could find, even if it meant sacrificing his daughter. She wrote about Eldritch, about the strange, unexpected kindness he had shown her, about the way he moved through the world with such quiet authority, such careful restraint. She wrote about herself, about the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming, and she found that the act of writing, of putting words to her emotions, made them feel somehow more manageable, less overwhelming. And no one disturbed her. No one questioned her. She was left alone, just as Eldritch had promised. She saw him only at dinner, a formal affair held in the grand dining room each evening. They sat at opposite ends of a long table, the distance between them both physical and symbolic, and spoke little. He would ask her polite questions, how she had spent her day, whether she had found the library to her liking, if there was anything she required, and she would answer just as politely, carefully, revealing nothing of substance. He did not press her. He did not demand more than she was willing to give. And she was grateful for that, even as she found herself curious about him, about the man behind the stern, unyielding mask. One evening, as they sat in that same silence, She found herself studying him more closely. He was older than her by 30 years, yes, but he was not frail. His shoulders were still broad, his posture upright, his hands steady as he cut his food. His face was lined, but not unkindly so, and his eyes, when he looked at her, which was rare, held a depth that surprised her. There was intelligence there, and weariness, and something that might have been loneliness. He was not handsome, not in the way young men were handsome, but there was something compelling about him nonetheless. Something that suggested strength, resilience, perhaps even a capacity for tenderness that he had learned to hide beneath layers of formality and restraint. "You are staring," he said, his voice cutting through her thoughts, and she felt her cheeks flush. "I apologize," she said quickly, looking down at her plate. "Do not," he said, and there was a faint trace of amusement in his tone. "I am your husband. You are permitted to look at me." She glanced up, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile on his lips. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it had been there, and it softened something in her chest. "I was only wondering," she said hesitantly, "about you, about your life before this." He set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on hers. "What is it you wish to know?" She hesitated, unsure how far she could push. "You have been married before," she said carefully. "Twice before." His expression did not change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "I have." "What happened to them?" He was silent for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. But then he said, his voice quiet. "The first died in childbirth. She was young, too young, and the labor was difficult. The child did not survive either. The second succumbed to fever 3 years later. She had been frail, always, and the winter was harsh. I did what I could, but it was not enough. Both were kind women. Both deserved better than the life I gave them." Celestine's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. He inclined his head. "As am I." He paused, then added, his voice even quieter. "You need not fear the same fate, Celestine. I do not expect heirs from you. I do not expect anything from you, save that you allow me to provide for you, to give you a life that is, if not happy, at least bearable." She stared at him, stunned. "You do not." "No," he said firmly, and there was a finality in his voice that left no room for argument. "I'm too old for such things, and I have no desire to burden you with them. I have seen what childbirth can do, what it can take from a woman, and I will not ask that of you. You are my wife in name only, if that is what you choose. I will not force myself upon you. I will not demand that you share my bed, or bear my children, or perform any of the duties that society expects of a wife. You are free to live your life as you see fit within these walls, and I will not interfere." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she looked away, overwhelmed. She had expected so much worse. She had expected to be used, to be reduced to a broodmare, to lose even the fragments of autonomy she still clung to. But he was offering her freedom, limited though it was, and she did not know how to respond. She did not know how to reconcile the man sitting before her with the cold, cruel figure she had imagined, the monster of whispered rumors and dire warnings. "Thank you," she whispered, and it was all she could manage. He said nothing more, and they finished their meal in silence. But the silence felt different now. Less oppressive, less lonely, almost companionable. As the weeks turned into months, Celestine found herself settling into her new life with a strange sort of ease. She and Eldritch maintained their careful distance, their polite dinners, their unspoken understanding, But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift between them. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, such as they were. She found herself curious about his thoughts, his opinions, his past. And she found herself wondering if perhaps beneath his cold exterior there was a man worth knowing. A man who had been shaped by loss and grief and loneliness, just as she had been, and who had learned to protect himself by building walls so high and so thick that no one could reach him. But the walls were not impenetrable. She had seen cracks in them, glimpses of the man beneath, and she wanted to see more. One evening, as they sat in the library, a habit they had fallen into, taking tea together after dinner in the warmth of the fire, he asked her a question that took her by surprise. "Do you miss your old life?" She looked up from the book she had been reading, startled. She paused, considering. "I miss what it could have been," she said slowly. "I miss the possibilities, the dreams I had, the future I imagined. But I don't miss the life I had. It was not much of a life, truth be told. My mother was lost to me long before I left. And my father—" She stopped, her throat tightening. "My father was never truly present, even when he was standing right in front of me. He was always chasing something, always trying to reclaim something he had lost, and I was just in the way." Eldritch nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And this life? How does it compare?" She met his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be honest. "It is not what I imagined," she said. "But it is not as terrible as I feared. You have been kinder to me than I had any right to expect. Kinder than I thought possible." Something softened in his eyes, and he looked away, staring into the fire. "I am glad," he said quietly. "I did not wish to make you miserable. I have made enough people miserable in my life. I did not wish to add you to that list." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that sounded like regret. "My first wife, Isolde, she was so young, too young. I should never have married her, but her family was insistent, and I was lonely, and I thought perhaps it would be different. But she was terrified of me. She could barely look at me without flinching, and I could see the fear in her eyes every time I entered a room. And then she was with child, and I thought perhaps that would change things, that she would be happy, that we could build something together. But the birth," he stopped, his jaw tightening. "She died, and the child with her, and I've carried that guilt ever since. And then Meredith, my second wife, she was different, older, calmer, but she was also sad, always sad, and I could not seem to reach her. I tried, but I was too clumsy, too awkward, too set in my ways. And then she fell ill, and I watched her waste away, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing." Celestine felt her heart ache for him, for the pain she could hear in his voice. "It was not your fault," she said softly. "You cannot blame yourself for things beyond your control." He looked at her then, and she saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. "Can I not?" he said. "I chose to marry them. I chose to bring them into this house, into this life, and they both died because of it." "No," she said firmly. "They died because life is cruel and unfair, and sometimes terrible things happen to good people. But that does not make it your fault. You loved them. You cared for them. That is all anyone can do." He stared at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Perhaps," he said, "but it does not make it easier to bear." "No," she agreed. "I suppose it does not." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, and Celestine felt something shift again, something that felt like understanding, like connection. She had thought of him as cold, as distant, as someone who could not feel, could not care. But she saw now that she had been wrong. He felt deeply. He cared deeply. He had simply learned to hide it, to bury it beneath layers of formality and restraint, because showing it had hurt too much. Winter came, and with it, the first snow of the season. Celestine woke one morning to find the world transformed. The grounds of Ashencourt Manor blanketed in white, the trees heavy with it, the sky a pale, luminous gray. She stood at the window of her room and watched the flakes fall, and felt a pang of something that might have been longing. She had always loved the snow, the way it made everything seem clean and new, the way it muffled sound and softened edges. She found herself wishing, absurdly, that she could go outside and feel it on her face, let it catch on her lashes, and melt on her tongue the way she had when she was a child. Would you like to walk in it? She turned to find Eldritch standing in the doorway of her sitting room, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable as always. She had not heard him knock, had not heard him enter, and she felt a flutter of surprise. Yes, she said, surprised by the offer. I would. He nodded and gestured toward the door. Come then, before it grows too cold. They walked together through the gardens, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet, the world hushed and still around them. Celestine tilted her face up to the sky, letting the flakes catch on her lashes, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. Eldritch walked beside her, silent as always, but his presence was steady, grounding, and she found herself grateful for it. They did not speak, but the silence was comfortable, companionable, and she felt as though they were sharing something, some quiet moment of understanding that did not need words. After a while, she stopped and turned to him. Thank you, she said, her breath misting in the cold air. For this, for everything. He glanced at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before, something that might have been affection, or perhaps simply understanding. You deserve more than gratitude, Celestine, he said quietly. You deserve happiness. She looked at him, her heart pounding. Do you believe that is possible? She asked. For us? He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said, his voice low and rough, I do not know, but I would like to try. And in that moment, standing in the snow with this man who had been a stranger, who had become her husband, who was slowly, tentatively, becoming something more, Celestine felt the last of her walls begin to crumble. She reached out and took his hand, and he did not pull away. He held it, his grip firm and warm, and together they stood there in the falling snow, two lost souls trying to find their way home. The months that followed were a revelation. Celestine and Eldritch grew closer, not with the passion of young lovers, but with something deeper, something built on mutual respect and understanding. They talked for hours in the library, debating philosophy and literature, sharing stories of their pasts, their fears, their dreams. He taught her about the estate, involving her in decisions that he had always made alone, and she found herself taking pride in the work, in the knowledge that she was not just a decorative fixture, but a partner, someone whose opinions mattered, whose insights were valued. And slowly, carefully, they began to touch. A hand on her shoulder as he passed, his fingers brushing hers as they reached for the same book. A kiss on her forehead before he bid her good night. Each touch was a question, a tentative offer, and each time she did not pull away, she felt the space between them shrink a little more. She found herself looking forward to these moments, craving them in a way that surprised her. She had not expected to feel this way, had not expected to want him, but she did. She wanted his presence, his company, his touch. She wanted to know him, to understand him, to peel back the layers of formality and restraint and discover the man beneath. One night, as they sat by the fire, he reached for her hand and held it in his thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles. The gesture was tender, intimate, and she felt her breath catch. "I never thought I would feel this again," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "This sense of connection, of wanting to share my life with someone, not just out of obligation, but because I genuinely want to." "Nor did I," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She had thought her capacity for feeling, for caring, had been numbed by the circumstances of her life, by the knowledge that she had been sold, that she was a commodity rather than a person. But sitting here with him, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, she realized that she had been wrong. She could still feel. She could still care. She could still want. He looked at her, his gaze searching, and she saw the vulnerability there, the fear that perhaps he had misread her, that perhaps she did not feel the same. But she did. She did, and she wanted him to know it. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a soft, tentative kiss that tasted of tea and firelight and something sweet and fragile. He froze for a moment, surprised, and then he kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle, reverent, as though she were something precious that might break if he held her too tightly. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin. "I do not deserve you," he whispered, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Perhaps not," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But you have me nonetheless." Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a sense of renewal that Celestine had not felt in years. The gardens bloomed, the house filled with light, and she found herself laughing more than she had ever thought possible. Eldritch was still reserved, still guarded, but he smiled more often now, and she had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the small gestures that spoke of his affection. He would leave flowers in her room, picked from the gardens himself, their stems wrapped in simple twine. He would bring her books he thought she might enjoy, rare volumes he had unearthed from the depths of the library. He would sit with her in the evenings and read aloud, his voice deep and soothing, and she would close her eyes and let the words wash over her, feeling more at peace than she had ever thought possible. They were walking through the gardens one afternoon, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, when he stopped suddenly and turned to face her. "I have something for you," he said, and there was a hint of nervousness in his voice that made her heart flutter. "Another gift," she teased gently. "You spoil me, Eldritch." "This is different," he said, and he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. He opened it, and inside was a ring, a simple band of gold set with a single sapphire, the stone the deep blue of a summer sky, so vivid it seemed to glow in the sunlight. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "And her mother's before that. I gave it to my first wife, but she did not live long enough to wear it properly. It has been locked away ever since, and I thought perhaps it was cursed, that it brought bad luck to those who wore it. But I do not believe that anymore. I think it was simply waiting for the right person. For you." Celestine's breath caught, tears springing to her eyes. "Eldritch," she whispered, her voice trembling. He took her hand, his grip gentle but firm, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her, and she stared at it through her tears, overwhelmed. "I know I am not what you dreamed of," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I am old and cold and far from perfect. But I love you, Celestine. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone again. And I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of you, trying to give you the life you deserve, the happiness you deserve. She threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face, and held him tightly, as though she could anchor him to her, as though she could keep him safe from all the pain and loss he had endured. You are worthy, she said fiercely, her voice breaking. You are more than worthy. You have given me more than I ever thought possible. You have given me freedom and kindness and love, and I love you too. I love you so much it terrifies me. He held her close, his face buried in her hair, and she felt his shoulders shake with silent emotion. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, and Celestine thought that perhaps, just perhaps, this was what happiness felt like. Not the wild, passionate happiness of fairy tales, but something quieter, something deeper, something real. Years passed, and Ashencourt Manor became a home in truth. Celestine filled the library with her writings, publishing under a pseudonym that no one in society would ever connect to the Duchess of Ashencourt. Her novels were well received, praised for their insight into the human heart, their unflinching examination of love and loss and longing. Eldritch stood by her side, her greatest supporter, her fiercest defender, the man who had given her not just a life, but a purpose. He read everything she wrote, offered thoughtful critiques, encouraged her when she doubted herself. He was her partner in every sense of the word, and she could not imagine her life without him. They grew old together, not in the desperate, clinging way of those who fear the end, but in the quiet, contented way of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. They took long walks through the gardens, sat by the fire on winter evenings, traveled to London for the season when they felt like it, and retreated to the peace of Ashencourt when they did not. They argued sometimes, as all couples do, but they always made up, always found their way back to each other. They were happy, and that was more than either of them had ever dared to hope for. And when Celestine looked back on that terrible night, the night she had wept in her room and believed her life was over, she could hardly recognize the girl she had been. That girl had been lost, frightened, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. But she was not that girl anymore. She was Celestine Ashford, Duchess, writer, partner, beloved, and she was happy. The gift Eldritch had given her that first night, the key to the library, the promise of freedom, had been the first step on a journey she had never imagined taking. But it was the journey that had followed, the slow, steady building of trust and love and partnership, that had truly set her free. She had learned that freedom was not just about being able to do what you wanted, but about being seen, being understood, being valued for who you were. And Eldritch had given her that. He had seen her, not as a pawn or a possession, but as a person, a woman, someone worth knowing, someone worth loving. As she sat in the library one evening, the fire crackling, Eldritch reading beside her, his hand resting gently on hers, she thought that perhaps the best gifts were not the ones that arrived with fanfare and spectacle. Perhaps the best gifts were the ones that came quietly, unexpectedly, and changed everything. She looked at the man beside her, this man who had been a stranger, who had become her husband, who had become her love, and she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hand. He looked up, his eyes warm and questioning, and she felt her heart swell with love for him. "For everything," she said, "for seeing me, for loving me, for giving me a life I never thought I could have." He smiled, that rare, precious smile that she had learned to treasure, and brought her hand to his lips. "No, my darling," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. You have given me more than I ever thought possible. You have given me hope and joy, and a reason to look forward to each new day. You have given me a life worth living." And in that moment, Celestine knew that whatever else her life had been, whatever else it would be, she had been given something far more valuable than wealth or status or even youth. She had been given love, true, deep, abiding love, the kind of love that did not demand or control, but simply existed, steady and sure and unshakable. The kind of love that saw her for who she truly was and cherished her anyway. The kind of love that made her feel, for the first time in her life, truly free. She leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the gentle weight of his hand in hers. And she knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The end. If you loved this story of unexpected love and second chances, don't forget to like this video, comment below what surprised you most about the Duke's gift, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional journey. Share with someone who believes in the power of kindness.